My name is Jacob, and for most of my marriage to Emily, I thought I understood her. We'd been together for over a decade, built a life, raised 2 kids, and weathered our fair share of challenges. But over the past few months, something changed. It wasn't sudden. It was gradual, like a leak in the foundation of a house that you don't notice until the floor starts to creak. And by the time you notice, the damage is already done. Emily started coming home late, really late. At first, it was occasional, something I could write off as the natural ebb and flow of her busy schedule. She works in marketing, and sometimes that means long hours and last-minute projects. Or at least, that's what she used to tell me. But then, long hours turned into her walking in the door well past midnight, barely acknowledging me before slipping into bed. I'm not the confrontational type. I'd ask her about her late nights, trying to sound casual, but her answers were vague and dismissive. "Oh, just work stuff," she'd say, her eyes glued to her phone or the floor. When I pressed for more details, she'd roll her eyes and sigh, as if I were interrogating her about some minor inconvenience. It wasn't just the late nights, though. Emily started acting distant. Conversations that once felt natural and warm now felt forced and awkward. She'd retreat to another room when I tried to talk to her, claiming she was tired or had a headache. The intimacy that once defined our relationship had evaporated. It was like living with a stranger. And then there were the lies. Little things at first, like saying she had a meeting downtown when she was clearly dressed for something more casual. Or claiming she had a work dinner but returning home with the faint smell of perfume that wasn't hers. I wanted to believe her, to trust that she wasn't hiding something. But trust is a fragile thing, and mine was starting to crack. The breaking point came one evening when Emily left her purse on the kitchen counter. I wasn't snooping, at least not at first. I was cleaning up after dinner and moving things out of the way when I noticed a receipt poking out of her wallet. Curiosity got the better of me. I pulled it out, and my heart sank. It was a check for a $300 dinner for 2 at a restaurant I'd never heard of. The name of the place was scrawled in fancy script. Definitely not the kind of spot Emily and I would frequent. We were more of a burgers and beer couple, not fine dining aficionados. And $300? That was way beyond her usual spending habits, especially for a work dinner. I stared at that receipt for what felt like hours, my mind racing. Who was she having dinner with? Why didn't she mention it? And why was she spending so much money? 100 possibilities flooded my thoughts, each worse than the last. I didn't confront her right away. Part of me was afraid of what she might say, while another part hoped I was just overreacting. Maybe there was a perfectly reasonable explanation. Maybe it was a client dinner, or maybe her boss had joined. But deep down, I knew there was no reasonable explanation for this. Not when paired with her sudden coldness, her late nights, and her lies. For the first time in our marriage, I felt like I didn't know my wife at all. That night, as Emily slipped into bed next to me, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling. Her breathing was steady, as if she didn't have a care in the world. Meanwhile, my thoughts were spiraling. I wanted to shake her awake, to demand answers, but I knew that wouldn't get me anywhere. Emily had become an expert at deflection, and I wasn't ready to play that game just yet. Instead, I decided to observe, to gather more information before confronting her. If there was something or someone she was hiding, I needed proof. I wasn't about to accuse her of something so serious without knowing for sure. But the thought of what I might uncover terrified me. The next day, I tucked the receipt into a drawer in my office, out of sight but not out of mind. I couldn't shake the image of that $300 meal or the questions it raised. Every time Emily glanced at her phone or stepped out of the room, I found myself wondering, was she texting someone else? Was she planning her next secret outing? The suspicion was eating me alive, but I had no choice but to wait. If Emily was hiding something, it was only a matter of time before she slipped up again. And when she did, I'd be ready. After finding that $300 dinner receipt, I couldn't shake the gnawing feeling that Emily was hiding something big. The distance between us had grown into a chasm, and every glance, every word exchanged between us felt like a lie waiting to be uncovered. I knew I had to dig deeper, even if it meant facing a truth I wasn't ready for. One evening, as Emily was out again, supposedly for a late-night meeting, I logged into our family phone account. We had a shared plan that listed call logs and text records, though not the contents of the messages. I'd never bothered to check it before. There had never been a reason to, but now it felt like my only shot at getting some clarity. Scrolling through the logs, my heart sank. One number popped up over and over again, far more than any of her work contacts or our family members. Dozens of calls and texts, often late at night or during the hours she claimed to be working. The number wasn't saved in her contacts, which only made it more suspicious. Who was this person? I jotted the number down, contemplating my next move. Should I call it? Text it? I debated for hours but ultimately decided against it. I needed more concrete evidence before confronting Emily. For now, I would watch and wait. The opportunity came sooner than I expected. Our neighbor, Mr. Wilkins, had recently installed security cameras around his house. He was retired and had a knack for tinkering with tech, turning his home into a mini fortress of surveillance. His cameras faced the street, capturing the comings and goings of the entire block. Mr. Wilkins and I weren't particularly close, but we exchanged pleasantries often enough for me to feel comfortable asking for a favor. I approached him one afternoon, explaining that I'd noticed some unusual activity near our house and wondered if his cameras might have picked up anything. It wasn't a lie exactly, just not the whole truth. To my relief, he was more than happy to help. "Always good to keep an eye on things," he said, inviting me inside to review the footage. It didn't take long to find what I was looking for. There on his screen was Emily. The timestamp showed it was just a few nights ago, around 10 p.m. She was walking briskly toward a sleek black car parked a few houses down. The man waiting for her stepped out, holding the door open. He was older, probably in his mid-40s or early 50s, with salt and pepper hair and an air of authority about him. His suit was sharp, expensive-looking, and he carried himself with the confidence of someone who was used to getting what he wanted. Emily greeted him with a smile I hadn't seen directed at me in months. The man ushered her into the passenger seat before climbing into the driver's side. The car pulled away smoothly, disappearing down the street. My stomach churned as I watched the footage again and again, searching for any detail that might give me a clue about who this man was. A license plate, a logo on the car, anything. But there was nothing identifiable. That night, as Emily returned home, again well past midnight, I couldn't bring myself to look at her. The image of her climbing into that car with a stranger was burned into my mind. Every laugh she shared with him, every word she exchanged with him through those countless calls and texts. It all felt like a betrayal of the life we'd built together. I didn't confront her, not yet. I needed more. If this was going to end in a confrontation, I wanted every piece of evidence in my corner. In the meantime, I started tracking her movements more closely. I noticed patterns in her behavior when she left, how long she was gone, and the excuses she used. Each new lie she told only strengthened my resolve. The hardest part was pretending everything was normal. Around the kids, I tried to keep up the facade of a happy, stable household. Ethan and Laura were perceptive, though. They noticed the tension between Emily and me, the clipped tones and the absence of our usual banter. "Is everything okay, Dad?" Ethan asked one evening as I tucked him into bed. I forced a smile, ruffling his hair. "Of course, buddy. Just grown-up stuff. Nothing for you to worry about." But it was a lie, just like the lies Emily was telling me. And deep down, I knew this was only the beginning. The suspicious calls, the late nights, and the damning footage from Mr. Wilkins's cameras were already painting a grim picture of Emily's actions. But I still needed undeniable proof before confronting her. My gut told me I hadn't seen the worst of it yet, and sadly, I was right. It all came to a head one Friday evening. Emily had told me she had a work dinner that night, an excuse I'd heard far too many times before. She got dressed up in a way that wasn't typical for a work function. A sleek black dress, high heels, and more makeup than usual. She spritzed on her favorite perfume, one she hadn't worn for me in months, and hurried out the door with a half-hearted, "Don't wait up." I'd already planned to follow her. As soon as she left, I grabbed my keys, waited a few minutes, and then slipped into my car. Keeping a safe distance, I tailed her as she drove downtown. My heart was pounding in my chest, my mind racing with possibilities. Was she meeting that same man? Was this the night I'd get the answers I needed? Emily pulled into the valet parking area of a luxurious hotel, one of those places with marble floors, chandeliers, and doormen in tailored uniforms. I parked nearby, close enough to keep an eye on her but far enough to avoid suspicion. From the shadows, I watched as she handed her keys to the valet and walked confidently through the grand entrance. I hesitated for a moment, my hands gripping the steering wheel. Did I really want to do this? To see, up close, the reality of what I'd been suspecting for weeks? The answer came quickly, yes. I needed to know the truth, no matter how much it hurt. I followed her inside, keeping a low profile. The lobby was bustling with activity, a mix of well-dressed guests and staff hurrying about. My heart sank as I spotted Emily standing near the elevators. And there he was, the same middle-aged man from the security footage. He approached her with a warm smile, his hand resting on her lower back as he leaned in to speak. They entered the elevator together, the doors closing behind them. I stood frozen for a moment, unsure of what to do next. But then I noticed the concierge desk. Summoning every ounce of nerve I had, I approached the desk and explained that I needed to surprise my wife, who had just checked in. The concierge hesitated but eventually confirmed the suite number, a $450 a night room on the 14th floor. I took the next elevator up, my pulse racing with every passing floor. When I reached the 14th floor, I stepped out into the dimly lit hallway and found the suite. I could hear faint laughter through the door, Emily's voice mingling with his. I knocked. The laughter stopped, replaced by muffled whispers and hurried movements. A few seconds later, the door opened slightly, just enough for Emily's face to appear. Her expression went from surprise to panic in an instant. "Jacob? What are you doing here?" she stammered, trying to block my view of the room behind her. I pushed the door open, stepping inside before she could stop me. The man was there, standing awkwardly by the bed, clearly caught off guard. Emily tried to protest, to come up with some excuse, but I wasn't interested in hearing it. "What is this, Emily?" I demanded, my voice shaking with a mix of anger and hurt. "Who is he?" She looked at the man, then back at me as if trying to decide how much to admit. Finally, she sighed and sat down on the edge of the bed, her shoulders slumping in defeat. "I'm sorry, Jacob," she said quietly. "I didn't mean for you to find out like this." The man, clearly uncomfortable, muttered something about leaving and quickly exited the room. When the door clicked shut behind him, I turned back to Emily, waiting for an explanation. I've been so unhappy," she said, her voice breaking. "You don't understand how hard it's been for me. I feel like I've been invisible for years. Like you don't see me anymore." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Unhappy? Invisible? Emily, we have a family, a life we built together. How could you throw that away for this? She looked down at her hands, unable to meet my eyes. "It's not about him. It's about what I'm missing. I needed emotional support, Jacob. I needed to feel wanted, and I wasn't getting that from you." Her words hit me like a freight train. The anger I felt was almost blinding, but beneath it, there was a deep, aching sadness. How had we gotten here? How had the woman I'd loved for so many years become someone I barely recognized? I couldn't stay in that room any longer. Without another word, I turned and walked out, leaving Emily sitting alone on the edge of the bed. The elevator ride down felt like an eternity, and by the time I reached my car, I was trembling. That night, as I drove back home, I knew our marriage would never be the same. The confrontation in the hotel room should have been the breaking point, but in some twisted way it wasn't. Emily came home that night, and we fell into an awkward, painful silence. She didn't apologize further, and I didn't ask for more explanations. Instead, the days passed with an unbearable tension between us, like a house of cards waiting to collapse. But the final straw came just a few days later during yet another argument. It started over something small, as these things often do. A late-night phone call she stepped outside to take. When she returned, I asked her who it was, and her vague, dismissive response triggered everything I'd been holding back. "Why are you still doing this, Emily?" I said, my voice rising despite my efforts to stay calm. "I saw you. I saw everything. And yet you still act like I'm the one being unreasonable." She rolled her eyes, as if I was a child throwing a tantrum. "Jacob, I told you already. I felt invisible. I needed something you weren't giving me." Her nonchalance sent me over the edge. "And what about Ethan and Laura? Did you think about them while you were sneaking off to hotel rooms? Or were they invisible too?" Her face darkened at the mention of the kids, but instead of addressing my point, she doubled down. "You're such a hypocrite. Do you think you've been the perfect husband? Do you think you haven't made me feel alone in this marriage?" It was like talking to a wall. No matter what I said, she deflected, twisted my words, and refused to acknowledge the pain she'd caused. I couldn't do it anymore. For my own sanity, for the sake of our kids, I had to take action. That night, as Emily slept in the guest room, I made my decision. I wasn't going to let our children live in this toxic environment, caught in the middle of a crumbling marriage. They deserved better, and I was going to give it to them, even if it meant uprooting our lives. The next morning, while Emily was at work, I started packing. I told Ethan and Laura that we were going to visit Grandma and Grandpa for a little while. They were excited. My parents lived on a quiet piece of land about 200 miles away, and the kids loved spending time there. I packed only the essentials: clothes, toiletries, school supplies. I didn't want to make it seem like we were leaving for good, even though I knew deep down that this wasn't just a short trip. Before we left, I sat down at the kitchen counter and wrote a note for Emily. "Emily, I've taken the kids to my parents' house. We need time to think about what's next. Please don't contact me unless it's about Ethan and Laura. They are my priority now, and I won't let them be hurt by what's happening between us." I left the note on the counter, placed my wedding ring beside it, and walked out the door with Ethan and Laura in tow. The drive to my parents' house was long and quiet. The kids chatted in the back seat, blissfully unaware of the storm brewing behind the scenes. I envied their innocence, their ability to see this as nothing more than an impromptu trip to see their grandparents. When we arrived, my parents greeted us with open arms. They could tell something was wrong. My mother's concerned glance lingered a little too long, and my father's handshake was firmer than usual, but they didn't press for details. I was grateful for that. After settling the kids into their rooms, I sat down with my parents and explained everything. The late nights, the lies, the hotel room. My mother's face turned pale, while my father's jaw tightened with anger. "You did the right thing, Jacob," my father said firmly. "The kids need stability right now, and you're giving them that." Emily's reaction was exactly what I expected. Explosive. The first call came less than an hour after we'd arrived. I ignored it. Then came another and another until my phone was vibrating nonstop. Finally, I picked up. "What the hell, Jacob?" she screamed the moment I answered. "Where are you? Where are the kids?" "They're safe," I said calmly, trying to keep my voice steady. "They're with me at my parents' house." "You can't just take them," she yelled. "You have no right to do this. This is kidnapping, Jacob. I'll call the police if I have to." Her words were like daggers, but I refused to back down. "Kidnapping? Emily, I'm their father. I'm doing what's best for them. If you want to talk about custody, we can do that. But not like this." Her threats escalated, turning from police involvement to legal action. She accused me of being manipulative, controlling, and vindictive. But all I could think about was the look on Ethan and Laura's faces when they'd finally have to confront the truth about their mother. The calls didn't stop, and neither did the text messages. Emily sent paragraphs filled with accusations, pleas, and demands, each one more desperate than the last. But I held firm. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I was doing something right. Not for Emily, not for myself, but for our kids. They were my priority now, and I wasn't going to let anything jeopardize their well-being. If I thought leaving with Ethan and Laura would be the end of the nightmare, I was sorely mistaken. What followed was a level of manipulation and public humiliation I never could have anticipated. Emily wasn't going to let this go quietly, A week after I left, I got a call from a friend who sounded concerned. "Jacob, have you seen what Emily's been posting?" he asked. Confused, I checked social media, and there it was. A long, emotional post from Emily painting herself as the victim. She wrote about how I kidnapped our children and taken them without her consent. She talked about feeling trapped in a controlling marriage and how she was only trying to regain her independence. She left out every detail about her infidelity, conveniently making me the villain in her story. The post gained traction almost immediately. Friends, acquaintances, and even strangers began flooding her comment section with messages of support. They called me names I'd rather not repeat and urged her to stay strong. But that wasn't the worst of it. Emily took her story to the local media, giving an exclusive interview where she painted me as a manipulative, unstable husband. She even hinted at emotional abuse, though she stopped short of outright accusing me. I watched the broadcast in disbelief as she tearfully recounted her version of events, the anchor nodding sympathetically. By the end of the segment, I was livid. She had turned our personal crisis into a public spectacle, weaponizing the court of public opinion against me. Knowing that Emily was preparing for a legal battle, I decided it was time to gather evidence. Hard, irrefutable proof of her lies and infidelity. My first step was to compile all the correspondence I had, text messages, emails, and phone logs. I printed out the records from our shared family phone account, highlighting the hundreds of calls and texts to the unknown number she'd been communicating with for months. Next, I reached out to Mr. Wilkins, the neighbor who had provided me with the initial footage of Emily getting into the black car. He was more than willing to testify if needed and provided me with additional timestamps where his cameras had captured her suspicious behavior. I also contacted the hotel where I'd confronted Emily and her lover. While the manager couldn't provide footage due to privacy policies, they did confirm that Emily had booked a suite multiple times over the past 3 months. As the public backlash against me grew, I kept my head down and focused on building my case. My lawyer, an old family friend named Michael, assured me that evidence would win out over public opinion. "Social media isn't the courtroom, Jacob," Michael said firmly during one of our meetings. "Emily's trying to control the narrative, but judges care about facts, not Facebook likes." He advised me to gather character statements from people who knew Emily and me as a couple. I reached out to close friends and neighbors, many of whom were shocked to hear the full story. Some had even noticed Emily's strange behavior over the past few months and agreed to provide statements. Meanwhile, Emily escalated her tactics. She filed an emergency motion accusing me of kidnapping and sought sole custody of the kids. Her lawyer claimed that I had endangered their well-being by taking them without her consent. But when the hearing date arrived, I was ready. In court, Emily's lawyer painted a picture of a distraught mother who had been blindsided by her husband's actions. Emily, dressed in a modest outfit that screamed sympathy, dabbed at her eyes with a tissue as her lawyer recounted her version of events. Then it was my turn. Michael calmly presented the mountain of evidence we'd gathered. He walked the court through the phone records, showing Emily's consistent communication with her lover. He played the footage from Mr. Wilkins's cameras, which clearly showed her getting into the car with the man in question. And he provided the confirmation from the hotel, which proved that Emily had repeatedly booked a $450 a night suite during her supposed work meetings. Finally, Michael presented the character statements and testimony from neighbors who had witnessed Emily's erratic behavior and her neglect of the children. By the end of the hearing, Emily's tearful act had lost its luster. The judge, a no-nonsense woman in her 50s, wasn't swayed by the social media circus or Emily's carefully crafted image. "The evidence presented by Mr. Jacob is compelling," the judge said firmly. "It's clear that this is a complex and emotional situation, but the well-being of the children must remain the priority." She granted me temporary custody of Ethan and Laura, ordering both Emily and me to attend mediation sessions. The judge also issued a gag order, forbidding either of us from making further public statements about the case. After the hearing, Emily glared at me as we exited the courtroom. "You think you've won?" she hissed under her breath. "This isn't over, Jacob." But for the first time in weeks, I felt a sense of relief. It wasn't a definitive victory, but it was a step in the right direction. Ethan and Laura were safe with me, and Emily's attempts to tarnish my reputation had started to backfire. The tension leading up to the next court hearing was almost unbearable. While the temporary custody arrangement gave me a small sense of relief, I knew it wasn't over. Emily's threats echoed in my mind, and her ability to manipulate public opinion still loomed over me like a storm cloud. This hearing would determine the future of my children and possibly redefine my entire life. The day finally arrived. I stood outside the courthouse, clutching a folder filled with evidence, my lawyer Michael by my side. He'd spent weeks meticulously preparing our case, and I trusted him implicitly. Still, my nerves were frayed. As I walked into the courtroom, I saw Emily sitting at her lawyer's table. She looked composed, polished even, but there was a flicker of something in her eyes. Unease, perhaps. The proceedings began with her lawyer presenting their case. He painted a picture of Emily as a devoted mother who'd been victimized by a controlling husband. According to him, her actions stemmed from a lack of emotional support and feeling trapped in our marriage. It was a narrative designed to tug at the judge's heartstrings, but it was also one that ignored the mountain of evidence I was about to present. Emily testified, shedding a few tears as she described the pain she'd endured. She denied neglecting the children, claiming her late nights and frequent absences were all work-related. She avoided admitting to infidelity outright, dancing around the truth in a way that made my blood boil. When it was my turn, I took a deep breath and stepped forward. Michael guided me through my testimony, ensuring that every piece of evidence was presented clearly and concisely. First, I laid out the phone records. I explained how I had discovered the excessive calls and texts to the unknown number, Emily's lover, and how it had been happening for months. Then, Michael presented the surveillance footage from Mr. Wilkins's cameras. The video clearly showed Emily getting into a car with the man in question, a man who was not a business associate or family friend. Next, we introduced the records from the hotel. Multiple bookings for an expensive suite, each coinciding with nights Emily claimed to be working late. It was undeniable proof of her deceit. Finally, we addressed her neglect of the children. I testified about her frequent absences, her lack of involvement in their lives, and how her actions had created an environment of instability. Michael also presented character statements from neighbors and friends who had witnessed her behavior firsthand. As the evidence stacked up, Emily's composed demeanor began to crack. She avoided eye contact, shifting uncomfortably in her seat as the truth unraveled before the court. Her lawyer tried to deflect, arguing that her actions didn't directly impact her ability to be a good mother. But the evidence was too damning. The judge, a sharp and experienced woman, didn't miss a beat. She took notes, asked pointed questions, and made it clear she wasn't swayed by emotional appeals. After hours of testimony and arguments, the judge finally delivered her ruling. Based on the evidence presented, it's clear that the actions of both parties have had an impact on this family, she began, her tone firm but measured. However, the well-being of the children must remain the court's primary concern. At this time, the evidence supports Mr. Jacobs' claim that he has provided a more stable environment for the children. She granted me temporary custody of Ethan and Laura, pending further mediation sessions between Emily and me. She also issued a strict gag order, prohibiting either of us from making any public statements about the case. This court will not tolerate attempts to manipulate public opinion or use media platforms to further inflame this situation, she added, casting a pointed look at Emily. The decision felt like a weight lifted off my shoulders, but it was bittersweet. While I had won this round, the battle wasn't over. Mediation sessions would force us to confront our issues face to face, and Emily's vindictive streak made it clear she wasn't going down without a fight. As we left the courtroom, Emily glared at me. "Enjoy your little victory, Jacob," she hissed. "You'll regret this." I didn't respond. Her words didn't matter anymore. What mattered was that Ethan and Laura were safe, and I would continue to fight for their future. When the dust settled from the courtroom battle, I finally felt a flicker of hope. The judge's decision to grant me temporary custody of Ethan and Laura was a relief, but I knew better than to celebrate. This was just the first step in what could be a long and grueling fight. Emily had lost the upper hand, and for the first time, I felt like the truth was on the verge of prevailing. But there was no mistaking the fury in her eyes as she left the courtroom that day. Her threats echoed in my mind, but I refused to let them shake me. I had too much to lose. My children's future depended on my resolve. Life didn't magically return to normal after the court's ruling. Ethan and Laura were still processing the upheaval, and I was doing my best to shield them from the ugliness of the situation. I knew they sensed something was wrong. Ethan, at 12, was old enough to pick up on the tension, though he never asked directly. Laura, only 8, seemed to cling to the idea that this was just a vacation at Grandma and Grandpa's. The mediation sessions ordered by the court were brutal. Sitting across from Emily in a small, sterile room with a mediator trying to maintain neutrality felt like a cruel joke. She played the part of the remorseful mother, claiming she only wanted what was best for the children. But her thinly veiled jabs and her refusal to take accountability for her actions showed me she hadn't changed. Each session left me emotionally drained, but I kept reminding myself why I was doing this. Ethan and Laura deserved peace. They deserved stability. Emily's attempts to reclaim her narrative continued to backfire. The court-ordered gag order forced her to stop making public statements, but the damage she had done to her credibility was already apparent. Her lies had alienated mutual friends, many of whom reached out to express their support for me once the truth came to light. Even her lawyer seemed to grow weary of her antics. During one mediation session, he subtly urged her to compromise, emphasizing the importance of focusing on the children rather than continuing to fight me at every turn. Emily bristled at his suggestion, but it was clear that her position was weakening. Weeks later, the judge reviewed the progress from mediation and the reports submitted by both parties. Michael had meticulously compiled everything: Emily's infidelity, her emotional instability, her neglect of the family, and her reckless behavior. In a final hearing, the judge delivered her decision. While not a permanent ruling, it was a significant step forward. The court granted me primary custody of Ethan and Laura, with supervised visitation for Emily until she could demonstrate a genuine commitment to their well-being. Emily's face was a mask of fury as the ruling was read, but there was nothing she could do. The evidence was irrefutable, and her attempts to manipulate the situation had only hurt her case. As I left the courthouse with Michael by my side, I felt a strange mix of emotions: relief, exhaustion, and a lingering sense of unease. The fight wasn't over, not by a long shot. Custody battles are rarely resolved quickly, and I knew Emily wouldn't give up so easily. But for the first time in months, I felt like I was moving in the right direction. Ethan and Laura were safe, and I had the chance to provide them with the stability they desperately needed. That night, as I tucked them into bed, Ethan asked me a question that brought tears to my eyes. "Are we going to be okay, Dad?" I smiled, ruffling his hair. "Yeah, buddy, we're going to be okay. I promise. This isn't the happy ending I once envisioned for my family, but it's a new beginning. I've come to realize that the fight for my children's future isn't just about winning in court. It's about being the kind of father they can depend on, no matter what. I know the road ahead will be tough. Emily will likely continue to challenge me, and there will be days when the weight of it all feels unbearable. But I'm ready. I'll keep fighting for Ethan and Laura, for their peace, for their happiness, because in the end, they're all that matters."